Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your important work for us and taking time out of your busy schedules amidst being star organizers, writing up your PhD, dealing with burnout, and doing radically relational self-care and collective care in Renyo Wang's sense that we just heard about, to keep everyone, including yourselves, alive. I want to share your community, our community agreement with you, so you get a bit of a sense of this space. It's always a bit awkward, like, you know, entering into an existing space. I find, like, as someone who gives guest lectures myself, so I'm gonna do my guest. Okay, so this should give you a bit of an idea of, you know, who's in the space and what's important to folks. So this is something we came up with collectively in the first session and have been invoking as a ritual ever since. So this is week 2. It's an intensive course. So we're only going to meet for 3 weeks, but it means that we do see each other every day and kind of become like pandemic buddies and a tighter classroom community than maybe would happen otherwise if we only saw each other once a week. So community agreements, confidentiality, step up, step back, don't yak my yum, call people in, not out, cancel culture versus accountability, active listening, share power and responsibility, positionality, denaturalize assumed norms of whiteness, cis heteropatriarchy, able-bodiedness, value lived experience, respect the labor involved in theorizing oppression, acknowledge we are not always experts, elevate marginalized people's voices on their own lived experience, respect different ways of learning and contributing, lean into discomfort. It's okay, it's part of growing and learning and of building relationships. Embrace opportunities to learn from each other, pass on the mic if your voice has been heard, ensure there's space for others, use trigger warnings, be mindful of images shared, no circulation of trauma porn, of racialized bodies in pain or being harmed. Access. Acknowledge and respect different capacities, share responsibility for access. It's okay to ask for what you need. Be ready to repeat yourself. Be mindful that folks may be fasting. Share responsibility for pronouns and for addressing misgendering. Chip in with stretching, breaks, and meditations. Child-friendly space, bring your little ones. I actually promised to bring my little one today, but I copped out because I wanted to focus on the conversation. How can we build a safer, braver space where everyone's needs are respected? Pleasure activism, self-care and collective care, aspire to be your whole 3-dimensional self, show up as you are and allow others to do the same. There's room for self-reflexivity, compassion, growth, fluidity, dynamism, and change, especially with regard to gender. Imposter syndrome, honor who we are and what we each bring, no shaming or blaming of self or others. Let's give ourselves permission to be the rightful badasses we are. COVID care, we're living through an ongoing traumatic experience, self-compassion, mutual aid, be open to uncertainty. And a few questions that have guided us. Critical self-reflection, will this cause harm? Is it helpful, supportive, contributing to the discussion? How can we exist in relation and reciprocity to one another, both students and faculty? How can we ensure everyone's mutual learning and growth? How do we build and reinforce trust? How can we foster a culture of appreciation? And let's have a good time. So welcome to our 3 guest lecturers. I've learned so much from each of you. I met Gunjan as a community member a few years ago and later on as a healing practitioner. And she nearly became part of the Marvellous Grounds book that a few of you have read, edited by Cyrus Marcus Ware, Raida Musa and myself. And the Roundtable on Healing Justice basically has her in it, even though she wasn't able to make that morning because people keep citing her. Gita, it's so wonderful to have you here and to meet you. I've heard so much about your work on education, not incarceration. We actually had Leroy Newbold here as a guest lecturer last year and talking about kicking police out of schools as well as Freedom School. And I'm sure there's so many questions from people in the room. Edward, thank you so much for co-organizing this panel with me. Essentially, we had Sedna Fiati as a guest lecturer last year, and I thought I'd kind of invite you one by one, but you made it happen that we basically have a panel, which is even more exciting, and have everyone at the same time and as part of a conversation, which I guess being a collaborative project makes so much more sense, right? So I'm really excited to learn more about your work. I learn from you all the time from Facebook, posting about what you do, in solidarity with folks in Hong Kong. And also, I'd love to hear more about your PhD here at York in social work. There's actually 2 social work folks in the room. And I hope we can, hope it's okay to call on you, so Centauri and Jay. And I hope we can keep growing our little oddball community here in and beyond against the institution. So the 3 of you are founding members of the Tkaronto Mutual Aid Group. You were also involved in with Caremongering Toronto, I understand, for a while, which works very differently. So someone has extra money, for example, and then other folks need it, or vice versa. Whereas Toronto Mutual Aid seems to be more about like educating and sharing tools for organizing. You've organized some amazing teach-ins last year on harm reduction, surveilling and policing in Jane and Finch, food justice, Indigenous street outreach, that will forever stay with me. They were like amazing and crucial and just at the right time, and gave many of us reality checks and compasses to grounding our own work during the pandemic with a better collective purpose. So thank you so much for that. People have read your bios and have clicked on the links and have educated themselves about your work. So I'm not going to read out your bios again, but instead I was going to ask you for an introductory round if you could talk about what mutual aid means to you and what it looks like in your own activism, as well as the activism that inspires you. I don't know who wants to go first. Shall I call on you, or do you just want to unmute yourself?
I can try to jump in. Hello, everyone. So honored to be here, and I just want good segue. Actually, I love the agreement earlier, especially the point around acknowledging we're not experts. I always introduce myself when I teach that I'm not an expert. I mean, partly it's just my own anxieties. Like, I hate this part about academia, the pressures to present ourselves as experts, but it's also really antithetical, I think, to ideas around mutual aid. We've if you've read Dean Spade, you've read Huang, it's all central to that is this notion of horizontality and moving away from saviors, right? We're not talking about charity. We're not talking about fellow social workers in the room, which is why we need to abolish social work. But as these benevolent people that are going to help support others, in this kind of hierarchical way. And likewise today, I think we're here to join the conversation, not necessarily to impart any specialized knowledge. I mean, a lot of this, what we share, is rooted in our own experiences, so we're here in conversation. I think. I guess to connect to that, you might have seen on my bio, as a PhD student here at York, and I already mentioned about social work. A big part of it is this idea of social work abolitionism, right? And recognizing, what Huang talks about, where care in itself might again seem on the surface like something uplifting or helpful, when in reality how it's institutionalized by the state, it's instead very much just another tool in the carceral system, right? We can think of, so my background's actually in the mental health field, and how much the mental health field has helped expand policing, right? So that's why I burnt out after 5 years doing the work. The amount of police violence I witness and not just witness, but be complicit in, the amount of times, we had to call the police, had to, right? Even, these situations, what situations are deemed as requiring that type of intervention is important to interrogate. And I think, yeah, it's important to question if this is really what we want and what what should be a model of care in society. So yeah, I think mutual aid is about presenting an alternative, and I'm really excited later on when we're going to be able to share some alternatives to that. Oh, let me actually, I forgot to share. People are curious about my research. There's a very short briar patch piece I wrote a while back, especially with the, it's really an amazing moment right now where abolitionism has become mainstream and in the forefront, but the dangers of co-option is always there, right? And we've seen a lot of, including CAMH itself, major mental health institutions in the country saying, yes, defund the police, but not interrogating their own partnerships and connections. And so much that's being presented again is about expansion of the carceral state versus actually providing something outside of the violent practices, right? So yeah, I'd share that people are curious.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that with us and for writing it as well. I feel like even among abolitionists, there was like this really awkwardly long moment where, even like Angela Davis would be like, wrong institution, people should, have access to mental health services. And I guess like context of the US where like there's been this massive, slash back, cut back of all kinds of services. But, I feel like, these kinds of interventions are so important, have really like helped the prison abolition movement kind of, get more on track with disability and mental health. So thank you. Who wants to go next? Gita, Gunjan?
Gunjan, you want to go? Okay, I'll go. So hey everyone, really nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for having me here. Really excited for this conversation. I have so much respect for Ed and Gunjan and the work that they do. So yeah, just happy to be here and meet all of you. So for me, mutual aid means, for me, it comes from a place where the state has really failed in just providing the basic needs for people. And beyond that, the state actually enacts so much violence on people and on our communities. And so when I think about mutual aid, for me, it's about redefining safety, what that actually means, what people actually need to be truly safe. And certainly that's not the police. It's about sort of like, for me, just fundamental questions about how do we protect each other from violence that is enacted by the state, and how do we support each other in meeting even just our basic needs and more within a system that is so deeply unjust and violent and cruel and causes so much pain and suffering. So it's like trying to find within that ways to actually create spaces of care and joy and mutual support. That's sort of the driving force. I think Dean Spade in the article, I really liked the framing around, it's really about thinking about changing material conditions beyond symbolism. And there were three sort of ways put forward. One was dismantling systems that are really harmful, but also directly providing people with things that are like the people who are targeted by these systems and institutions. How can we actually fill in some of those gaps and provide for each other? But then also, how do we build alternative infrastructure and frameworks? And so I think within the course of my own activism, I've sort of shifted from the first one into the third, where I spent a lot of time actively really fighting against systems. And I still do that and think it's really critical, but I'm in a place right now where I'm really focused on, well, what does it look like to build alternatives in really material ways, sort of like on the ground in the community? What does that look like? You know, a lot of us have been reading a lot about abolition, and so I think some of the work that the three of us have been trying to do in different ways, not to speak for others, but I know that we've been doing some of this together, is to think through and actually figure out, what does this look like in practice? What does this look like in the day-to-day? How do we show up for people when they're in crisis, but if the cops are called on them, they're going to be in a way worse situation and at risk of so much more violence? So I think that's sort of what the questions that I've really been thinking through and trying to put into practice over the past few years is, what does this look like in our relationships, in our communities, on the ground, in the day-to-day? So, and I know we'll talk more about the actual projects soon.
I just want to also quickly amplify like Gunjan's last point, or not last point, earlier point about caring for one another by bringing Miriam Kaba. I always loved their response to a question about kind of one thing that's often misunderstood in organizing. And you know, I think a lot of us here in this room probably has been burnt out at one point or another from organizing spaces. And so, I mean, I'll just quickly read it out. Miriam says that's a really difficult question because I'm so uninterested in narratives. That word that gets used often, narrative building, people that want to be all about narrative shifting, narrative building. I believe that when we are in relation with each other, we influence each other. What matters to me as a unit of interest is relationships. And I mean, for me, anyway, not to say narrative building isn't important at all. It's just that I think so many organizing spaces forget that we can't sustain each other and sustain these spaces if we don't actually focus on taking care of one another. So and you know, movements grow with the people in it. So yeah, just wanted to bring that in.
Gita, you had something to say as well.
I was just gonna add on to something Gunjan was saying, which is that, you know, there's this really long history, and it sounds like you already had a conversation about this morning, but, you know, a really long history of people sort of practicing mutual aid for survival. And, you know, and there's so much to learn from folks from so many communities and people who have been doing this for so long. But I think there's also this interesting moment right now where it is being co-opted. And, you know, that I've seen that the city is now trying to support people in some way and creating neighborhood pods and engaging in mutual aid at the same time as they're evicting people from their homes and from encampments and ramping up policing and all of this stuff. So it's just, that is something that I'm seeing happen right now, just this like real sort of like swallowing and co-optation of mutual aid. And yeah, just Gunjan sort of mentioned that, and I just wanted to build on it a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. I think there's often this misunderstanding what mutual aid is as well, right? In a way that ties in with neoliberalism and let's slash back all the services and exempt the state from its responsibility. And I love that in the teach-in, the AS American Studies Association teach-in with Maria Mukaba and Dean Spade and Dylan Rodriguez, who's a colleague of mine, where Maria Mukaba gives this example of working with AOC, right? Who's basically part of the state, and how you can basically abolish the state at the same time as holding it accountable. So let's move on to our next question. I don't know who wants to take it first. How does COVID impact your communities and the communities that you're allied to? Gita, do you want to go first since you're already unmuted?
Oh, I did. Okay. Sure. So my main, so I'm, you know, we're all parts of lots of communities in different ways, but I guess what felt the most important to me at the beginning of COVID was that I'm a high school teacher. I was also an elementary school teacher before that. And just the ways that the school closures, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, were really disproportionately impacting working class families and racialized families due to things like job loss, lack of childcare, income insecurity, food insecurity, all of these things that were just converging at the same time on families that really, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of families that actually rely on schools for some of that support. And so in particular, I was really concerned about all my students and all of the young people who rely on school nutrition programs throughout the city, and just the way that schools being closed, but all of a sudden, but no real plan for that kind of support to continue, was leaving a lot of people extremely food insecure. And I see the ways that my students come to school without having eaten, and was really, really concerned about what was going to happen with the school closures. So that was a huge concern at the beginning of the pandemic, and led to myself and some colleagues creating this sort of like emergency relief program that we called Food for Thought. Do you want me to talk a bit about that now, or get into it afterwards? Now? Okay, so yeah, a colleague and I, sorry.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Okay. So we basically thought, we need to figure out a way to fill in this gap right now, because this is actually really about survival for a lot of our students and their families. It's really urgent. So we just started reaching out to other education workers and collecting some money, and we partnered with Food Share, which is a food justice organization in the city, to start getting some food boxes of fresh fruits and vegetables out to our students and their families. And it kind of just built into this much bigger thing where we had like 150 education workers delivering food boxes all over the city. And specifically, we were very clear that we wanted that the program is for racialized and working class and low income families. And we ended up spending like $150,000 on food over the course of 6 months. I think, in a lot of ways it was sort of like an emergency. I mean, Dean Spade talks about, and many people talk about, the difference between charity and solidarity. We were really aware of that, and really working to frame the program and to understand what we were doing in terms of solidarity and mutual aid. And some of the ways we did that was in the political framing of the program. We were it wasn't just about, like teachers doing nice things for students, which is certainly how the media was trying to frame it. So all of the media that I did was like, oh, tell us all about these really nice teachers volunteering, and it was like, we always had to bring it back to, actually, no, this isn't about teachers doing a nice thing. This is about the failures of the school system, of the failures of the government to just offer basic support to families. This is about families who are falling through the cracks, families who are being evicted from their homes, who don't have safe and affordable shelter, who might not have status and be targeted because of that, families who are over policed, families who are not able to feed their children and dealing with extreme poverty as a result, not of their own failures, but of the failures of the state. And so we really had to sort of make sure that our messaging was not one of charity and sort of just like what the media was trying to frame it as, and bring it back to the systemic and structural issues. I think we also were trying really hard to frame it for education, do some movement building with education workers, and frame sort of the donate. We collected $150,000, but we were really trying to frame that as, you all of us still have an income throughout this entire pandemic. I mean, we're still working, but we are in a very privileged place to continue to have an income where many people do not. So this is a project of income redistribution. Like, what can you actually give in order to redistribute what has been a very unfair sort of like spread of the way that the way that capitalism has like worked and functioned through the pandemic, to sort of like even increase the income disparities even more than they already were before. So we were trying to frame it as a project of income redistribution. And there were also no eligibility requirements. We were working to do this in as relational as a way as possible and through building trust on the ground. And we had a lot of the folks who were recipients of the boxes ended up becoming volunteers. So we were trying to really have it be sort of cyclical and mutual in all of the ways that we could. And we also understood that as education workers, we receive a lot of support from the public as well. Like last year, a year and a half ago, when there were walkouts and strike actions and things like that, our students and a lot of their families really supported us. And so we didn't see this necessarily as a one-way giving, like the way that that young people and their families support education workers is really critical for us as well. So yeah, those are some of the ways that we understood it as a project that was framed by the principles of mutual aid. At the same time, it was still an emergency relief project that was reliant on donations and a small number of people volunteering to keep it going. So it was really not something that is feasible in the long term, but I think it was really helpful at the beginning of the pandemic when everything was so chaotic. I mean, it still is, but it was like a particular kind of chaos.
Amazing. Thank you so much for letting us be part of that interdependence, that, like witnessing the kind of teacher and parents for teachers kind of organizing as well. That's happening in Ontario. Yeah, has been pretty amazing. So who wants to go next? So the question was, how does COVID impact marginalized communities during the pandemic? How does COVID impact marginalized communities?
And then I saw your eyebrow nudge. You want to go?
I can go, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to necessarily repeat what folks know or are experiencing themselves, but we know that COVID has disproportionately impacted marginalized folks, right? In terms of like, I think the question was framed as like, what are my communities, or like communities like we're allied to? And it's a great question, because I think that's definitely like this term community is something I'm like trying to make sense of constantly, like being a queer person in Toronto, like we talk about queer community a lot, but I think what's been really interesting about the pandemic is it's really kind of shown like in various levels, on various ways, like what am I trying to say? Like, what are the actual communities? Like, what are the formations? Who are the people who are disproportionately impacted, right? Like, even when we see like where the hotspots are, it's very easy, I think, to sometimes think about like us being, yeah, even something like queer community, but then really, or even like BIPOC queer community, but then really thinking through like how class really impacted and is impacting how people are experiencing this, right? And it's not easy for anybody, except, the Westons and whoever's making millions off of this, I guess. But it has been really different. And I think that's been a really, sorry, that's not your question, but I think that's been a really like interesting and useful clarifying sort of moment here in this pandemic. And so, so part of my community is like other politicized healers in the general Toronto area. So that's like therapists, acupuncturists, herbalists, folks who've been sort of doing like supporting movements, supporting folks on the front lines for like some time now. And it's with them that we really started the People's Healing Fund, which we launched a month before the pandemic hit. So obviously this was already an ongoing issue, and I can talk a bit more about it maybe in the next section, but one of the impacts on politicized healers is, like some folks, so depending on whether our work is in person, whether it's regulated, whether it's not, some people have been out of work, some people are working, some people are overworking. And then, another community that I support is like my clients, which are primarily like outsiders of some sort, whether they're like queer and trans folks, BIPOC, frontline workers, harm reduction workers, midwives, politicized folks. And yeah, as I'm sure people are experiencing in their own lives too, like it's the mental health crises that have been happening through this are profound, and sort of the like starkly different realities again that people are living, like some people who have entire families who have been impacted by COVID, who've lost people, who have lost people or are losing people across the world. And then others for whom it hasn't been as in their face, but it's been more like, excuse me, more about just the like stresses of like having kids at home and not childcare, or taking care of elderly folks, or I think just the burnout and profound collective grief that we're all experiencing, and very few have had a chance to really tune into, because the crisis is still ongoing, and the nature of it is that we've lost many of the community supports that we would otherwise turn to. So I'm really glad that spaces like this, like, classes like this are really prioritizing this kind of work and these conversations, because it's so important and so lacking, I think, in a lot of people's lives. And then, yeah, so I also was participating in some rent strike actions when the pandemic first hit. So I was, because I was out of work, I didn't know when I would be working again. I ended up getting evicted, so that sucks, but it's okay. I mean, it's personally okay for me, but it continues for lots of people. So that's also another community of folks in my neighborhood, starting to organize with folks in my neighborhood who were rent striking or at risk of eviction. The pandemic also allowed me to like have a different sort of sense of place. Like I was rarely leaving my neighborhood for a long period of time, and actually starting to organize in the neighborhood, like what Gita and I've been doing with the Bloordale Community Defense Group, has been really incredible to sort of situate us, because even though I'd been there for like 7 years, I had very few ties to the neighborhood as such, or it's sort of a place that people pass through. So we can talk a bit more about that project too, but what else would I say about that? I think, and then, yeah, like my parents are in Mississauga, so sort of seeing what's happening in Peel is another thing, and I have family in India. So that's another community I'm connected to, where, yeah, a lot of my relatives are sick. Yeah, so it's impacted all of us in various ways, and yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much for sharing. I just remembered that we completely forgot to do the guided meditation because I was also, you mentioned nerves earlier. I'm a nervous public speaker. I mean, you probably don't notice because I do it a lot, and I'm just kind of dealing with the nerves is like part of, getting the adrenaline going and, enhancing the performance at this stage. But actually, Snezhana had offered to do a guided meditation with us. Would it be totally weird to do that now in the middle of the panel? Okay, great. Snezhana, are you still willing to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to close my window for a second.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone that has shared so far, and really being open and bringing your whole self to this conversation. Really, really appreciative. So why don't we take a moment and ground back in our bodies, because there's a lot of things in our minds and our thoughts and our hearts. So I invite you to get comfortable. You can turn off the camera if you'd like to make yourself more comfortable. Find a position that you can sit comfortably in. If you feel comfortable and safe, you can close your eyes. If not, you can just keep your focus downwards and relaxed. And maybe just open your hands and put them palms down so that they're relaxed and comfortable and kind of grounding towards the earth with your palms. And let's just take a few deep breaths just to center back into our body and bring our attention inwards. So let's maybe start with just one deep breath by inhaling together and exhaling. And feel free to inhale and exhale in whatever way you enjoy, whether that's through your nose, through your mouth. And let's do that 2 more times. Inhale. Exhale. If you need to make a sound, make a sound. Inhale. And exhale. So we'll just come back into our body by connecting with our senses. So let's just bring to notice our feet right now, whatever position they are. Maybe they're touching the floor, maybe they're touching each other or another part of our body. Just notice how they feel against what it is that they're resting. Notice any heaviness or lightness. Notice any sensations. Bring our attention to our knees. Just noticing how our knees are feeling. Maybe we're wearing something on top of them. So noticing the article of clothing against our knees, against our skin. Or maybe we're not, and noticing just the air, the sensations of it on our skin. And let's bring our attention to our hands, to our palms. Just let them feel heavy and rested in whatever position you have them. Seeing if you can notice each of the fingers. And just bringing all of your attention to your body, its physical sensations. And let's bring our attention to our face. Notice how your eyes feel in your sockets, how your jaw feels. And you don't need to change it or do anything. It's just grounding yourself through observing. Let's invite our other senses by just noticing any sense around us. Maybe we can pick a scent that we notice and just for a second or two, identify it. Let's awaken our sense of hearing and see if we notice anything around us as a noise, There's a sound, or maybe it's internal sounds with our internal hearing. Maybe it's our heart, our stomachs. And let's bring our focus back to our palms, noticing what the temperature of our hands is, what it is that they're touching, the texture of what it is that they're resting against, and slowly moving them in a way that feels comfortable, allowing yourself to come back into this space. Open your eyes if you have them closed.
Thank you so much, Snejana. That was the perfect time for it. Edward, when you're ready, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm also a really anxious speaker, and one thing I won't miss about going back after is not having my dog on my lap while I teach. So also reminded, of course, of like mindfulness as a, its roots in collective practice, especially in the Buddhist tradition, and how that's been so criminalized under colonialism. So again, it's important that we take these steps. So thanks for that. Okay, so I think we were talking about the impact on communities, and past couple of years I've been doing work in the Chinese communities around the country, and I think a lot of the processes that Gita and Gunjan has mentioned, obviously, are also very apparent in the communities I work with. The diaspora has been kind of hit by a double whammy of certainly the health implications of COVID, but also the social and economic consequences. And we have to remember that Chinese and by virtue, I think Asian identities in Canada in general has been so intertwined with the notion of kind of being carriers of disease and lacking in hygiene and inherently sick and diseased. I mean, we can always think of the term sick man of East Asia to describe, I think it was originally applied to the Ottoman Empire, and then it got spread to China, the country itself, and then, its people, right? I remember first coming across that Dong Abeng Fu in as a child watching Bruce Lee films, and he goes into I think he sees a giant sign with that, and he like cracks it over his knee, and that was kind of great little moment I remember growing up. And by the way, if people are interested in that history, you want to know more, there's something I wrote at the start of the pandemic. But so we can see the impact of it by how Chinese restaurants and businesses were some of the first to be impacted. It happened during SARS, and happening again now with COVID. And the most impacted was, of course, the workers who saw shift cancellations, job loss. We had at CCNCTO, we had people phoning in of Chinese workers working at other businesses that were asked really early on in the pandemic not to come in. Caregivers, living caregivers and cleaners especially were impacted, and with flyers presuming again that well, they're Asian, they're a vector of disease, we don't want that risk. We work also a lot with grocery store workers, right? So essential workers that on the one hand, you see with marketing campaigns, with government statements being heralded as important workers, and yet not receiving any proper remuneration in consideration of risk. Still continued issue about poor sanitation and safety equipment at grocery stores. A little better now, but still the problems persist. and obviously we all know about the issues around sick days and the government's continued negligence and around refusing to institute that. There's also been, of course, a very visible uptick in kind of anti-Asian violence, along with kind of horrorism, anti-sex worker violence, the tragedy in Atlanta. People might not know as well that even in Toronto, we've actually had a number of cases against sex workers in the midst of the pandemic. And actually, especially with bylaw officers who kind of targeted massage parlors and so forth. So, that's been an ongoing issue. Maybe I'll talk briefly about Hong Kong. I mean, we were in such a unique position in relation to the pandemic. I mean, a lot of Hong Kongers were still dealing with the collective trauma of SARS. I used to always share an anecdote growing up about, being, school canceled, and I grew up in Hong Kong, and, being, everyone was kind of quarantined at home, and really scary. The news every day had a death kind of ticker, the number of people who passed, and it's really sad. I never thought this anecdote would become, like, stop being shocking, and that I could just say, and it's like, well, it's what we have now, but here we are. I think there's issues around just, the proximity and the, again, that collective trauma with SARS that made kind of Hong Kongers kind of hyper aware of COVID. And again, feeling really odd because I know, my family's everything, when the pandemic first hit, there was a huge panic around that. And then while here in Canada, people weren't concerned at the time. Again, it wasn't us, so who cares? And then it happened again. It felt like the deja vu when the pandemic hit here. And, just very briefly, there's also the backdrop of the protests in Hong Kong against the extradition bill, where, there's fears around activists and labor organizers being extradited up to China, which led to large scale protests. And that was further with the police violence led to even greater numbers. And there's huge issues with economic inequalities in Hong Kong, fostered by a electoral system that, for example, grants corporations half the seats in the legislature. It's a little more subtle here, but over there it's pretty in your face, where banking sector will have a seat in the legislature, textile and so forth. So, when the pandemic hit, that context of the crackdown against those protests kind of mixed in with the pandemic, where, I'll actually talk more about it maybe in the next question about role of state in creating safety, but just to say that the pandemic has really been used as a pretext to further crack down on people's autonomies and people's organizing efforts.
Thank you so much. There's actually Debbie, who, I don't know, are you here today? Debbie wants to write her final paper on anti-Asian hate crime. So please ask a question during the Q&A, because it's a nice opportunity to talk to someone who's done a lot of amazing thinking around it and organizing. So I was wondering, our three panelists, if we should take question 3 and 4 together, because they're kind of related, right? So how you see the role of the state in creating safety during COVID, and it's a devil's advocate question. I think I know your answers, but might still be worth spelling it out, where the actual safety comes from, as Gita just said, but also what alternative strategies for creating safety you've observed. And if you want to talk a little bit about the Facebook group as well, feel free to bring that in, because I know that people have read it as part of their required reading for today and maybe checked out some of the teach-ins. So I wanted to invite you, if it fits in, to talk a bit about that as well. So who wants to go first? Gunjan or Gita?
Go. Yeah, so yes, the state does not create safety. That's it. Like, I think that's not shocking to anybody here. So when it first hit, like as sort of what Ed was mentioning about the fact that, you know, this had started in China, people were impacted. And, you know, some of us, yeah, like folks obviously with part of diaspora communities, and also like I practice Chinese medicine, so also like within sort of my community of colleagues, like people were like, okay, this is a thing, this is happening. And of course here, you know, the state was not taking it seriously at all, right? Like people were being, no surprise to anybody, but we were being discouraged to wear masks. You know, East Asian folks who were wearing masks were the target of hate crimes, or being derided, or, you know, like, and so that was continuing. And so I guess speaking a bit to the Facebook group thing, you know, there's incredible examples out there of disabled folks, of marginalized folks, creating like rapidly creating communities and like models online to take care of each other. For example, with the power shutoffs that happened in the, oh God, where was it? In the US. And like the wildfires that have happened, like disabled folks have gotten together to make sure that people have, you know, have oxygen, have mobility devices, have the things that they need. And so there were incredible models out there. And so there were some folks who were talking about, you know, starting to get something together because the state hadn't responded yet. This is like early March, I guess. And so that's sort of where this Facebook group Caremongering came out of. And I've been on Facebook for many months. I don't know where it's at now, but at least at the time it was sort of a space where people were like, okay, this is happening. You know, quickly we created some like resource sheets of like, okay, what is COVID? What do you do if you get it? Where do you go? Where can you access like food, shelter, sort of the basics, and then people making these direct requests, people sharing information. And then out of that, and so Ed and Gita are also involved with that, and they can speak to their roles, but out of that, some of us, you know, it was a explicitly political space, but as we've been talking about how these things can become quickly depoliticized, or can be seen as sort of taking away from the work of like, you know, taking care of each other. There were some like tensions that arose, and so we actually formed Toronto Mutual Aid, which was a more explicitly political space, because one of the things that was happening and continues to happen is that people are really waking up. And this is a very clarifying moment for a lot of people in terms of not only how these structural inequities are impacting people, but also how we're all connected, and we all sort of have some sort of stake in some sort of role. And so that's where what you were alluding to, Jen, the teach-ins that we did on Toronto Mutual Aid were coming from that place where a lot of people were like, okay, like what is happening? And so we tried to bring in organizers who've been working with these things for a longer time to explain what the situation is, right? Like how the housing crisis, the fact that we haven't had adequate shelter space for many, many, many years, people were already being evicted, how that just became so much more exacerbated, how the overdose crisis, because of policies that criminalize and punish drug users, and the lack of a safe supply was already meaning that there were, you know, many, many people dying and suffering, and how all of that just became exacerbated, and people are continuing to be shoved into shelter spaces that have COVID outbreaks, right? When the safest thing actually to do is to be in a community outside in encampments. The safest thing to do would be to have housing, but of course that doesn't seem to be an option the state has explored. So yeah, so that's where Toronto Mutual Aid came from. I'll speak to my other projects after, but yeah, I want to give a chance to Gita and Ed.
I can go. So Yeah, I think I've spent a lot of time in interrogating the idea of safety. When we were trying to get police out of schools, um, the main sort of counter argument was that police keep schools safe, and so the question was always, well, whose safety and humanity are you centering in this concept of safety? Because perhaps it's true that the police keep some students in schools safe, but they actually make school extremely unsafe for a lot of students. So, you know, when we talk about safety, like the questions are whose safety, but also if we're saying that a space requires protection or is unsafe, there's always this threat to safety. Like that's the other question is who's the threat to safety that exists like in a school? Because that threat is always mapped onto the same bodies, the same criminalized bodies, Black and brown, poor people. You know, those are all, that always become, that threat to safety is always mapped onto the same people. And so I think really unpacking what we're talking about when we mean safety is super important, and important for us to think through when we're trying to create safety or alternative visions, or imagine what kind of a society we could live in where people are truly safe and beyond safety. That's just like a basic sort of that's just a baseline. Like, we want more than safety. We want to be able to thrive and, you know, just be able to live and make art and make whatever, like do all these beautiful things. And so I think maybe this is a good time to talk a bit about our community, our Bloordale community project. So this came together last summer, and it's kind of weird to talk about it because it's not sort of like wrapped up in a bow and we can say like, this is what it is. It's actually very messy. But I think that's the nature of these kinds of projects, is that we're actually trying to bring something into existence that is largely from the wisdoms of past teaching, but also a lot from our imagination and our vision of how things could be different. So last summer, this group came together. It kind of, I mean, from my personal perspective, my own involvement in it, my desire to sort of create a neighborhood-based abolitionist sort of community defense group came from a bunch of places. One is, you know, what I was mentioning before, like spending a lot of years trying to tear things down, and I still want to do that, but I also want to really look at what we can create. I also have a lot, I lived on Bloor Street on top of a store for 11 years and have intervened in many crisis situations on the street that I like often hear and then run down and intervene in. I know people have different levels of comfort with doing things like that, but I'm the kind of person that very much like becomes involved in situations like that and tries to de-escalate. And what I noticed over the years doing that so many times, and sometimes it was interpersonal conflicts, sometimes fights, sexual assaults, but often it was with some sort of conflict with the police. And what I noticed over many years of doing that is that I was often the only person, even if there were other people around, that actually intervened. And so I have been wanting for years to sort of like have a group of people that we sort of like skill up together and work together to be able to be effective in these situations, and not only come across them, but actually perhaps be called to these situations so that we can support, and so that the police aren't called, and so that we, you know, all of these, you know, just sort of like, what does that look like in practice? What skills are necessary, like on the ground in those actual situations? So there was an opportunity to kind of form a group like that last year when there was a local restaurant in our neighborhood that was the target of a lot of police surveillance and harassment, as well as a lot of white supremacist, like far right and Zionist harassment. And so I was talking with the owner, and she was like just telling me how her and her daughter were being, you know, just constantly being surveilled, and police and all these right wingers were dropping by and being really aggressive. And so I said, you know, if I try to get some people together, maybe you can just let us know the next time this happens and we can come by and support you. You don't have to be completely alone when this happens. And so that's how this neighborhood group kind of started, and it's evolved into all of this much bigger thing, but it's also kind of amorphous in a way. We're kind of in this iterative cycle of, as a group, we respond to something, we do the best we can based on what we know and the skills we have and all the discussions that we've had together, and then we come back and reflect on how it went, how we could do better, where we were able to support people, where we might have been ineffective, what we need to learn still, where the skills that we need to build. And then when the next neighborhood situation comes up, we hopefully are able to bring our new learnings into practice. So since last summer, we've actually intervened in quite a few situations, either things that people in our group have come across while they're walking through the neighborhood and just like called on our group through our group chat for people to come out, but then also through connections where people have heard that we're doing this kind of work and then have asked for our support in moments of crisis. It's actually been an incredible learning experience. I think in some ways we've been really effective and been able to stop some kinds of crises from escalating to a point where things could get very dangerous for a number of people involved. In some cases, I think we've been quite ineffective, and just, the learning that's come from that has been really important. We're currently organizing some skill shares, some internal skill shares, because people have really different readiness and feeling, and also take different levels of risk to be able to intervene in these kinds of situations. So we really recognize that and just want to build people up to a place where we can sort of like handle these situations collectively. Yeah, I don't know, Gunjan, if you want to add to any of that. It's been really amazing because we've also, many of us have been sort of like learning in and practicing sort of like within the realm of abolition for a while. And this feels like something really cool that's sort of like building something different, building an alternative to what the state sees as safety and protection, and actually having a structure, creating a structure for that within the community. We have a long way to go, but I think there are people from other neighborhoods who have been really for us across neighborhoods as well. So I think that there's a lot of cool stuff that can be done. Oh, it says my internet connection's unstable, so I hope I didn't cut out. But anyways, maybe Gunjan, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think you covered, I think you covered a lot of it. Like, do you think I can use that example of the man that we accompanied together? Yeah, I just feel like that case was such a microcosm of all of this. So as Gita said, like part of, what we started off doing was defending this restaurant, right? And so, we would just get an SOS call and come down. And so one of the days that we got this call, it was a man by himself, a young Black man who was talking about like rebel news or sort of these right-wing things. And so the owner, called on us, was like, okay, like this is a right-wing kind of guy. I don't know what he's, and he's refusing to leave kind of thing. And so a few of us got there, Gita and I got there, and what we realized was it was actually a man who was in some sort of mental health crisis, right? And he wasn't particularly tuned into the reality around us, like he was connected somewhere else. But it was the kind of thing where he, he came out onto the street and he was just sort of talking to people, was sort of not, like someone who could have been very quickly criminalized, right? And there were actually cops around, people were trying to flag down cops. And it was just a situation where that could have gone many different ways. And what Gita and I found when we talked to him and realized what was happening was Gita tried to get a connection to someone he knows where he's trying to go, so we could accompany him home kind of thing. And what ended up happening was that we got connected to his dad, who said that he had actually left the night before, I think, right? And from Mississauga. right? And he was just sort of, and so he didn't really know people around, it seemed, and he was just sort of on his own, and wasn't necessarily safe in that setting where someone could have easily called the cops on him. And so what we did was
and his dad had just filed a missing persons report with the police.
Right.
So the police were actively looking for him at this point as well.
That's right. Yeah. And so once we found that out, we're like, okay, like, you know, like we'll hang out with him until you get here. And because he was in Mississauga and had to figure stuff out, it was like a few hours. And so we actually, and you know, and once like, you know, we built a rapport with him and he realized that we were, you know, safer. Like we actually just had a really nice afternoon. Like it was a sunny day. We got some food, we like chilled in the park. We were able to like stay with him until his family came to get him, right? And like, it was just one of those things where like, it was just sheer luck that we sort of ended up in the situation where we thought we were like responding to like a right-wing kind of person, but it was someone who we actually wanted to support. And that situation could have gone so many different ways, right? But it was just sort of spoke to this thing of like, what does it actually mean when we have these, when we have neighborhoods where people can respond and like take the time and like actually care for each other outside of even what maybe a mental health professional would have done in that situation, right? Like, just like we didn't necessarily need to have any expertise on, you know, in psychiatry or like, it was just a very relational sort of like, okay, like, let's get some food, like, hey, let's chat about this, like, let's go to the park, like, and that's not, I think one of the things that is important to me about mutual aid is that I think we really have a culture of like experts and sort of like, this is like, oh, like, I don't know how to intervene. This is when we need like a social worker, a mental health professional, this kind of person, like, you know, but like, that's actually not true. Like a lot of these skills, like Gita was speaking to, are skills that we can cultivate for ourselves. A lot of us hold these skills anyway in different capacities. And yeah, so I think there's something really beautiful about that kind of possibility. And yeah, I can speak to the Healing Fund a bit if now feels like the time, or I want to make sure Ed has time too.
Yeah, so we have 14 more minutes. And I wanted to give students a chance to ask questions as well. So do you want to briefly talk about it and then we hand it over to Ed to kind of wrap things up? Gunjan, do you want to say a few words about it, but keep it to a minute or so?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so the People's Healing Fund, yeah, if folks saw the link already, like it's all there, but basically came out of, like I was saying, like my community of politicized healers, where a lot of us sort of go into this work trying to support our own communities. And for those of us who don't come from wealth or have like a rich partner, which is the other way that people do this work, it seems, is it's difficult to sustain ourselves if we're actually working with people who don't have a lot of money, right? And because we're sort of outside of the universal as it is healthcare system, you know, people sort of have to pay for these services, or we have to figure out other ways. And so the People's Healing Fund, in its first cycle, was an attempt to subsidize healing practitioners who are working class, BIPOC, working within their communities. And quickly, as I said before, like quickly after we launched, the pandemic hit. So we sort of pivoted a few times. So we ended up raising $30,000. We gave away about half of it to practitioners, some of it to folks needing funds for accessibility to different services. And then we gave away about half of it to people through like an emergency fund that we launched last spring, which is just $100 cash to anyone who applied. And so, and that was when a lot of people were out of work, who were practicing in person. And we also like made sure to include sex workers in that, because although obviously not all sex workers think of their work as healing work, but because it is involves being with bodies and involves care work in some capacity. And sex workers obviously were struggling, continue to struggle in these conditions. So I think actually a lot of our money ended up going towards sex workers, which is awesome. Yeah, and so we're just about to launch our second cycle, which will be a little bit different. But yeah, if you can stay tuned on our Instagram and website, it's going to launch at the end of the month. We're going to give away half the money to practitioners again and half of it to people actually seeking services. So that includes things like therapy, acupuncture, herbs, and oh, thank you, Jen. And yeah, and I think just sort of this idea again of, sorry, I've taken a minute. I'll talk after if there's questions. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll
Okay,
share it with the class
jump in
and
here.
include it in our. Yes, please.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would love for questions, so I'm just gonna be very brief here. But yeah, I just want to say, really inspired all the time from the work of Gunjan and Gita in Loredale. I think a couple weeks ago, actually no, I'll save the time. I'll just jump. I think really it offers a different model to the violence of mental health social work I described earlier, where the presumption isn't kind of the dangerousness of the person and the mental health survivor and responding to that, but instead the violence of the state and actually providing care to people. And again, since we're on the topic of mutual aid, also this alternative where it's a collective approach versus the individualized approach that so defines professional social work. Yeah, so it's an inspiring example, and again, shows the world we want to build is already here. People are doing it every day, right? But I mean, it also goes again, like what folks are up against in these cases where, so I was going to mention, but how a couple weeks ago, Gunjan and Gita responded to the scene of a police intervention around mental health crisis where a whole SWAT team was abseiling into the apartment. And there you can see again, that's the state model of response to supposedly help and care for communities. And going back to Gita's question, safety for who? Yeah, states do create safety, but for attempts to anyways, for itself and for those in power. In terms of COVID-19, we see this with how public health measures have been mobilized so much as a means to scapegoat and as a means to rely on racist kind of discourses in order to deflect from its own inability and inadequacies and incompetent experts have come up from, right? So-called experts in government and so forth, where like most recently we have this with the Ford banning international students and closing the border. Again, deflecting from how much transmission has happened in workplaces like warehouses and factories, and providing no assistance to essential workers. In Hong Kong, we've seen same alarming developments where they're forcing all migrant live-in caregivers who primarily come from the Philippines and Indonesia to get COVID tested. There's actually talks around forcing all live-in caregivers to get vaccinated, which sometimes is odd to bring up in this context, given the issues around vaccine shortages and so forth. But obviously, it's important to look at the political context and what happens when it's mixed in with coercion. It's not actually about inoculating live-in caregivers. It's about framing these people as responsible for the pandemic spread. Government officials have also previously kind of blamed South Asian communities in Hong Kong for, religious events or whatever as the reason. Yet, interestingly enough, so they did go through the forced testing, and only 3 positive tests out of hundreds of thousands of living caregivers. Yet the established outbreak sites in, say, gyms frequented by white communities in Hong Kong have not resulted in any response at all. So again, makes us question kind of what the intention of these public health measures are. Is it really about addressing the pandemic, or is it more about deflection and protecting the state and those in power? But that said, in this kind of hellscape of the pandemic, I think we can also point to some really inspiring mutual aid efforts as kind of non-expert and community-based responses to the pandemic. I love the question posed actually by Dula way earlier in their presentation around transnational mutual aid. And partly because it's also about recognizing that these issues of state violence we've mentioned are also transnational in nature. These structures of oppression are really global institutions, right? You know, when we talk about Israeli apartheid, we could talk about Western support for Israel, also Chinese support, which is less mentioned in terms of arms trade, and also how China is the third largest trade partner for Israel. In Hong Kong, you know, people don't know that in the 60s and 70s, it's actually the experimental grounds for Hong Kongers served as guinea pigs for police crowd control tactics and weaponry. You know, some of you might have read The Right to Name by Jasper Poor, who talks about kind of use of non-lethal in quotes, maiming of Palestinians as a means of control. Well, that was really first popularized in Hong Kong during the anti-colonial struggles with the firing of wooden batons, and the idea is you break someone's leg, and the police manual explicitly said it's to avoid creating martyrs that could possibly engender further resistance, right? So, you know, it's an ongoing history, and I think it's really difficult to challenge these processes without recognizing all of these transnational links. But again, we can also learn from how different movements across the world have responded to the pandemic, right? So I mentioned the protest earlier. Well, it also actually created infrastructures to respond to the pandemic. So earlier on, the experts we had the same thing here, right? You know, WHO and the Canadian government was discouraging mask use, and I think that also exacerbated, you know, the targeting of Asian folks in the community who were wearing masks. In fact, I was actually afraid of wearing masks earlier on too, because I was afraid if I went to a supermarket, I'd get heckled or attacked. You know, it's a very real issue, right? And yet it's the experts that also added fuel to the fire by discouraging it. In Hong Kong, we literally had a mask ban, which relied on the British colonial era emergency ordinance, you know, in response to the use of masks during the protests. So when the pandemic hit, the government was also discouraging mask use, saying, oh, it's not a serious thing right now. We don't need to be afraid of COVID. But because of the distrust of the government fostered by the protest movement, people weren't going to listen to that line, and people were also actively disobeying the rule around mask usage, right? So everyone was using masks, and there were stockpiles of it. We could also see a transnational link where a lot of us here in the West, a lot of family members, but also activist groups were trying to get masks to Hong Kong. Because at the time there was also, the ban also meant that the Chinese government had blocked importation of masks into Hong Kong. So right, there was the mask, almost universal masking right away, which helped kind of really push down the numbers, the pandemic numbers in Hong Kong. There was also the networks of resource sharing. So a lot of the new unions that formed during the protests were active in distributing the mask, in terms of also because the government was neglecting a lot of working class housing projects, right? It was these union and activists that were going in and sanitizing, cleaning, setting up sanitation systems. You know, I want to jump to discussion. You know, I'm sure people can Google. There's great articles on this, but you can kind of see a kind of more autonomous community-based approach. Everything from clinics, right? Because people are wary of the hospitals, given the number of mass arrests that have happened in hospitals. So people decide to set up their own underground clinic system. like we can replace, like we keep getting told that like, oh, people ourselves cannot provide this healthcare and these big items. Yet time and time again, from the Black Panther Party to what's going on in Hong Kong, we've shown communities can take care of each other. It's not this kind of rooted in this experthood that, you know, that we need to rely on people above us to provide this care. And you know, despite, you know, a couple waves in Hong Kong, nonetheless, you see the numbers are much lower than here in Canada. And I don't want to sugarcoat it too. I think in the movement, we also need to acknowledge issues around racism. There were issues around targeting of mainland folks, the same issues we had here. The healthcare union, which has been so effective in their strike at pushing for a government to start investing in PPE and so forth, but also those hints of this type of racial scapegoating. So it's important even in our movements to critically examine, or else we fall into the kind of carceral care model. But also just you know, just thinking of anti-Asian violence and how many times I've had to cite Jin's amazing book, you know, Queer Lovers, Hateful Others, and in terms of the dangers of ending up reinforcing and expanding state violence and carceral violence in efforts to challenge, you know, anti-Asian violence. And this happens in Hong Kong, happens here. Okay, I'll just end it there.
Wow, so many thanks to all of you for coming. And I also wanted to say thank you for engaging with the readings. That was so amazing. And also for suggesting readings. So Dean Spade was on the reading list, but Ed highlighted that actually Dean has done all this work on COVID. Why don't you teach that instead? And I don't know, in a way, the three of you have summed up the whole class. It's almost like we can end here today. You know, no, please keep coming back. But you've covered the whole syllabus, right? Like from, you know, abolition to transformative justice to building the world we want to live in, and like carving out spaces for joy and pleasure. Actually, our last session is going to be on pleasure activism. So thank you so much for sharing your beautiful works. I realize we've gone over time already, and the three of you are like super busy people. I know Gita has taken time off work to be here, but I wanted to ask you if you would be willing to stay around for one or two questions. If not, obviously, you know, please feel free to leave any time. So Jay says, so the praise is coming into the chat. Jay says, such a powerful and mindful morning. Thanks so much for bringing your voices to power here today with us. There's more information from Gunjan. Yeah, so we have time for maybe two questions. Would that be possible for you? Thank you. And there's more appreciations in the chat. Normally we kind of ritualistically read out the appreciations in the chat. But in the interest of time, I think I'm going to prioritize questions. So if you want to unmute yourself. I know Jenny might have a question, possibly, potentially. Sorry, Debbie.
Does Jenny
so
want
Laura
to
has a question
first?
You can go first, Debbie. I'll ask my question after.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jen and the panel for joining us today. I have a question regarding the depiction of hate crimes against Asians during COVID, and that the depiction was severely downplayed in mainstream media of the Atlanta spa shooting, where mainstream media depicted the perpetrator as having a sex addiction, which actually victimized and blamed and shamed the victims of the shooting, whereas the truth was actually the shooting was a hate crime against Asians. So obviously there was outrage in the Asian community, and activists from the community stood up and spread awareness on their social media platforms. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how BIPOC solidarity and mutual aid can play out in Stop Asian Hate social movements, especially in the Toronto context.
Actually, thank you for this question. Could we take a couple of questions and then maybe each of the presenters can pick out one that they're able to respond to? So Laura also has a question in the chat. What do you see as the future of mutual aid? And then I think Jenny had a question as well. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just wanted to first just say that how much I appreciate you and your work and for being here today. And I'm sorry, I can't remember who said this, but someone said the changing material conditions beyond symbolism. And I think that's just so powerful. And I would like to hear from maybe one of you about how that connects to horizontality and mutual aid and resource sharing.
Okay, so whoever wants to go first and choose what to respond to. Great questions.
I'm gonna give, well, the first question to go, and again, warning, I mentioned my anxieties. I'm really bad at thinking on my feet. I don't know how people do it. I admire those that can, so I'm gonna just see what I got. But, you know, I mean, that's partly why, you know, I described kind of this hellscape of, it's so challenging right now to organize, in that constantly dealing with contradictory messages, and, you know, so this issue of, you know, anti-Asian violence, and, you know, you mentioned, well, certainly the media framing around sex addiction, problematic on so many ways, you know, problematic in mental health framing, problematic in especially in how it individualizes these issues, and divorces it from the historic and systemic violence against sex workers, and you know, and issues of horism. And again, this isn't even unique to, like, oh, it's the media doing it. It's like, you know, we see it in how certain Asian activists have also taken on this issue. You know, a lot of the knee-jerk responses to attempts by sex worker groups like Swan in Vancouver, Butterfly in Toronto, and Red Canary in New York has been like, oh no, why are you guys framing this as a sex worker violence? Like, these were not sex workers or whatever, and creating that dichotomy. And you know, I've always learned a great deal from Aline and other activists at Butterfly. Really check out, and, you know, if you want, you know, you ask what can BIPOC and allies do around supporting this issue, go to Butterfly, donate, support their organizing, amplify their message. They're really do also crucial mutual aid work at fundraising, and providing material support for sex workers during, especially those who are Asian migrants in this context. Yeah, that it's a great chapter. There's so much to learn. But Aline that's always been, you know, why I talked about this push against this binary between who's deserving of help and who isn't. Because, I mean, and I get it, you know, like a lot of massage workers actually that I've spoken to also internalize this notion of like, and, you know, I'm sure part of it is this kind of creation of false scarcity around who can get resources, who cannot, or just internalizing these kind of media messages. But they'll also say, well, we aren't sex workers, and I don't know, we have nothing to do with them. But Aline so carefully kind of navigates that. We're always emphasizing that this is has to be a joint struggle, and sex worker issues have to be highlighted. So I don't know if this really answers the question, but I think we just, my only point is, as we push this, we always need to interrogate these binaries being pushed forward. And again, you know, I can't remember who, but the readings did touch on this notion of deserving and non-deserving, right? And really, mutual aid is about challenging those notions. And if we are to build a better society, we're going to need to dismantle those assumptions.
Thank you. Gunjan and Gita, do you have some final thoughts?
Well, I was going to answer another question, but I want to actually just add on to something Ed was saying. There was a really interesting conversation that has been happening really recently. A couple weeks ago, when Ford announced on that one Friday that police powers were going to be ramped up and, you know, a bunch of changes were going to be made really fast. There were a lot of organizations in Toronto that came together to think about how to collectively resist, especially that ramping up of policing, and to also have conversations around how different struggles can be connected, like the absolute necessity to connect the call for paid sick days to increased policing and understand the intersectionalities of those struggles. And it was really interesting because there was this tension in those, and these are like organizers who have been doing this work for so long. And there was this real tension between folks who were saying, no, like collectively, we need to only just push the government for paid sick days. And then some folks who were setting up like mutual aid solidarity funds is saying, well, like, yes, but we can't just do that because in the meantime, we need to make sure people are okay. But then the people who were calling for paid sick days were saying, well, no, because if we don't just focus on our demands to the government, then we're going to dilute the message, and and sort of like these mutual aid funds are just going to fill in gaps that the state should be filling. So there was this like really strong tension. And one thing that Ed just made me think about was that in that conversation, there were some folks from some sex worker organizations in the city who are saying, yes, we're behind the mutual aid projects, but historically, mutual aid funds have not always seen sex workers as deserving of those funds. So like, you know, we're down for creating these mutual aid funds and being part of these mutual aid community projects, but also who is seen as deserving? Do sex workers count in that? Like, who's deciding how these funds are administrated? So it's such a big conversation full of tensions. And I thought that was an interesting thing to highlight because it's just happening right now around the call for paid sick days. And really the importance of centering folks like sex workers and other people who are really marginalized, even amongst the left, is really important in these conversations. Just to really quickly, Jenny's question, I had brought that up just when I was starting. Dean Spade in the article that you all read and I read as well, talked about that changing material conditions and that there are 3 ways to do that. And one is dismantling systems, one is providing for people who are harmed by systems, and one is creating something anew. And I feel like all of these different projects we're talking about really fit into, like, to me, the second 2 are really about mutual aid in a way, you know, like, even just in my experience, the Food for Thought project was about providing for people who are harmed by these institutions, and some of the projects Ed and Gunjan talked about as well. But then our Blurdale Community Defense Project is a lot about building something new, building alternatives to policing, building alternative structures for safety. So yeah, in all of these cases, I think that it's a good question to ask, you know, like, is the work we're doing somehow transforming the material conditions and material realities of people and of our communities? So that's kind of where that framing came from. Thanks for the questions.
Excellent final words. Thank you. Gunjan?
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many great threads here, and my ADHD brain is going 1,000 miles a minute, so I'm going to try to focus. But yeah, like the sex worker question is such a key thing, and like also, so yeah, as an acupuncturist, as someone who's, you know, a lot of my colleagues are like massage therapists or people who do these kinds of like more legitimized sort of body work. It's totally an internal tension. It's totally something that we need to look at in terms of the whorephobia and the classism that's inherent in this, about why we don't want to be associated with sex workers, when it's not sex workers who are the problem, but it's, you know, it's the racialized misogyny that and white supremacy that is the problem. But that said, in terms of the future of mutual aid, or sort of even this tension that Gita's speaking to now, like I think moments like these, you know, I think it's Naomi Klein who talks about like disaster capitalism, right? Like how capitalism really moves in, and we can see that happening right now with like pushes for privatization on various levels, including schools, education, healthcare. But also there are also moments where we can really build, right? And we're also seeing that like the resistance, the global resistance at this moment is sort of unmatched. The like sort of informal general strike sort of thing that might be happening in the US, you know, with workers refusing these like shit jobs, is really exciting. And I think we need to look at this moment as a moment of a lot of possibility and potential. And we really need to build movements that can bring people in, and people are not going to be brought in or buy in if their material needs are not met. Like that's just it. And I think that's where some of my frustration with sort of the symbolic action, symbolic calls, petitions, all of this, like, sure, okay, it has its place, but we really need to look at what is materially impacting people's lives. And it's not that complicated. You know, there's no reason why we can't come up with a bunch, like dozens of funds that are very explicitly political, that are not nonprofits, right? That are not tied to government funding or corporate funding, but can actually, you know, you can have a fund that says like Doug Ford resign fund, you know, like, and it can be a very explicit political statement, but also be paying for people to meet their material needs. And I think that's sort of it. It's not mutual aid or other things. Mutual aid is an inherent part of movements and always has been, whatever you call it. I don't care that much about the name of it. It's sort of like, what are we doing to take care of each other and build something new? So I'll leave it at that.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much to you three for visiting us and leaving us with your wisdoms and a roadmap as well. Yeah, let's give our speakers another round of applause, however that's possible, on mute or through emoticons or by dropping appreciations into the chat. So there's like more appreciations up. If you scroll up, I hope you've all seen that.
Just wanted to say thank you to
Amazing
everyone for having us, and thank you, Jin, for organizing this. I already received a message from someone who wants to join our community defense group, which is really awesome. So there's other people that are interested in connecting into the organizing that's happening. Just let us know. You know, bringing new people into projects, and like also I'm also interested in all the projects you're all involved in as well, but maybe that's for another time. But thank you for your work, and I hope we can connect again at some point.
So one way to see some folks in this group in action would be by joining us next Wednesday morning. I imagine you're working again, but we're doing an event with Mocha Dawkins, where she's going to share from her film and also do a panel discussion with some folks in the room. I actually dropped it in the chat earlier, and I'm going to send you the link again. So if anyone needs to see me, please stay behind. Otherwise, feel free to continue dropping appreciations and yeah, leave in your own time.